The Alpha King had never believed in fate until the night a mute serving girl bit through his throat to save children who weren't hers. In the cathedral silence that followed, his blood pooling black on ancient stone, her trembling form awaiting execution, destiny made its revelation known through the most primitive of bonds. What began as forbidden ritual would end in an irreversible claim that shattered every law the pack held sacred. The great hall of the Thornwood pack reeked of wet fur and dominance, a scent Elara had learned to make herself small against. She moved along the stone walls like a shadow given flesh, her worn linen dress the color of ash, her bare feet silent on floors that had drunk the blood of 1,000 challenges. The other Omegas wouldn't meet her eyes. They never did. A mute Omega was already cursed. One who bore the silver scar of a severed tongue was something worse, a reminder that the pack punished those who spoke truths alphas didn't want to hear. She carried the ceremonial wine on a tarnished tray, her hands steady despite the weight of 100 contemptuous stares. Tonight, the pack celebrated the alliance between Alpha Garrick, their brutal, cunning leader, and the visiting Alpha King Matthias Ashencroft, whose territory stretched across 3 mountain ranges, and whose reputation preceded him like winter wind. The king sat at the high table, a figure carved from granite and old violence. His eyes were the color of storm clouds before lightning, and they tracked movement with the dispassionate focus of a predator who had forgotten what it meant to be prey. Elara had seen him arrive at sunset, his convoy of warriors moving with military precision, his own presence a dark star that bent the room's gravity toward him. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30 winters, but he wore his authority like a second skin. Scars traced his jaw and disappeared beneath the collar of his black ceremonial coat. When he'd entered the hall, every wolf in the room had felt the weight of his dominance, an invisible pressure that made even Alpha Garrick's smile turn sharp with unease. Now, as Elara poured wine into the king's goblet, she felt that pressure intensified. His gaze lifted to her face, lingered on the scar tissue where her tongue had been, then dropped away with clinical disinterest. She was nothing, a broken tool, beneath notice. She preferred it that way. Invisibility was survival. But as she turned to retreat to the kitchens, she caught the scent. Bitter almonds and nightshade, nearly masked by the wine's heavy bouquet. Her blood turned to ice. The goblet she'd just filled, poisoned. Her eyes darted to the shadows behind the king's chair, where Garrick's beta stood, with a smile like a knife wound. This was an assassination dressed as hospitality, a way to claim the king's territory while blaming a careless servant. A mute, worthless Omega who would be executed before dawn. The king's hand moved toward the goblet. Time became viscous, each heartbeat an eternity. Elara's mind raced through impossible calculations. She couldn't speak, couldn't warn him. If she knocked the cup away, guards would cut her down before she hit the floor, and the king would simply be offered another poisoned drink. Her death would mean nothing. The children sleeping in the servants' quarters, the orphaned pups she secretly fed, the young Omegas she protected from the worst of the beta's cruelty, they would have no one. But there was one way, one forbidden, ancient way that her grandmother had whispered about before they'd cut out Elara's tongue for spreading heretical knowledge. The Blood Vow. Omega to Alpha. Survival through binding. It required 3 things: genuine sacrifice, Alpha blood consumed, and the Omega's willingness to become property. The ritual was forbidden because it gave Omegas leverage. A wolf who survived the vow could demand anything, and the Alpha's instincts would compel obedience. It was why the old packs had criminalized it, why they'd murdered the grandmothers who remembered. The king's fingers closed around the goblet stem. Elara moved. She didn't think. Thinking was a luxury for wolves who had choices. Her body became pure instinct, the same instinct that had kept her alive through beatings, starvation, and the night they'd held her down and carved out her voice. She lunged across the table, scattering plates and candles, her small frame colliding with the Alpha King's armored chest. His warriors moved instantly, steel singing from sheaths, but she was already inside his guard, her teeth finding the junction of his throat and shoulder. She bit down with every ounce of strength her Omega body possessed. Blood flooded her mouth, hot, electric, tasting of mountain storms and ancient forests. The king's roar shook the rafters. His hand locked around her throat, could have snapped her neck with a thought, but she held on, swallowing convulsively, feeling the forbidden magic ignite in her veins like liquid lightning. The blood vow didn't require words. It required will, sacrifice, and she poured everything into it, her fear for the children, her rage at her powerlessness, her desperate, furious need to save something, someone, even if it cost her everything. The hall erupted into chaos. Garrick was shouting for her execution. Warriors surrounded them, weapons drawn. But Elara felt the exact moment the vow took hold. The king went absolutely still. His hand on her throat loosened, trembled. His storm-gray eyes, which had been cold and logical and utterly controlled, suddenly blazed with something primal, something that predated language and law and civilization itself. She felt his wolf rise to the surface, felt it recognize what she'd done, what she'd become. His nostrils flared, drinking in her scent, and his pupils dilated until his eyes were black pits reflecting her terrified face. Omega. The word was barely human, ground out through clenched teeth. His other hand came up, fingers threading through her hair with shocking gentleness, even as blood poured from the wound she'd inflicted. "What have you done?" She released his throat, gasping, his blood staining her lips and chin. Her hands fawned violently as she pointed, first to the goblet, now shattered on the floor, its contents spreading in a dark stain, then to the beta in the shadows, then to herself. The message was clear even without words. Poison. Assassination. I saved you. The king's gaze followed her trembling finger, and something terrible happened to his expression. The warmth of recognition, the involuntary bond forming between them, froze over into something arctic and absolute. He rose to his full height, still holding her, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of glaciers calving into frozen seas. "Garrick, Explain why your beta stands in the shadows of a poisoned cup, and why this omega, his grip on her tightened, possessive, claiming, felt compelled to sacrifice herself to save a visiting king. The hall fell silent. Garrick's face cycled through shock, rage, and calculation before settling on false concern. "Your Majesty, the girl is mad, broken. She has no tongue. She cannot even—"
"She has a tongue now."
The words dropped like stones into still water. Elara felt it too. The wound in her mouth, the place where they'd carved out her voice, suddenly whole and burning with new flesh. The blood vow. It healed what was broken, bound what was separate, made two wolves into something that could not be unmade. The king's warriors had already seized Garrick's beta. A quick search produced a vial of the same poison. The beta's confession came quickly under the king's glacial stare. Garrick had planned to blame the assassination on the king's own guards, to claim the territory in the resulting chaos, to position himself as the wronged party seeking justice. But Matthias Ashencroft wasn't listening anymore. His entire focus had narrowed to the small, blood-stained omega in his arms, whose heartbeat he could feel against his chest, whose fear scent was rapidly transforming into something else, something that called to every primitive instinct he'd spent decades controlling. "You invoked the blood vow." It wasn't a question. His thumb traced her jaw, tilted her face up to his. "Do you understand what that means?" Elara's new tongue felt strange in her mouth. When she spoke, her voice emerged rough and unused, barely a whisper. "It means I can demand anything, and you must grant it." "Yes." His smile was a blade's edge. "And then you become mine, irrevocably, completely, body, soul, and fate. Is that what you want, little Omega? To bind yourself to a stranger to save a pack that cut out your tongue?" "Not the pack." Her voice grew stronger, fueled by years of silent fury. "The children, the other Omegas, the ones who have no voice and no choice. I want them protected. I want them free. That is my demand, Alpha King." Something shifted in his expression. Respect, perhaps, or recognition. His wolf was howling inside him, demanding he complete the bond immediately, sink his teeth into her throat, and mark her before the entire pack. The logical part of his mind, the part that had built an empire through strategy and control, knew this was insane. He'd come here to forge an alliance, not claim a broken Omega who'd just destroyed his carefully laid plans. But fate didn't care about plans. And his wolf had already decided. Matthias Ashencroft had never believed in destiny. He'd built his kingdom on strength, cunning, and the absolute suppression of instinct in favor of logic. But as he stood in that blood-stained hall, holding an Omega who'd sacrificed everything to save him from a death she had no obligation to prevent, he felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of power. She was trembling, terrified, defiant, and absolutely, undeniably his. He turned to face the assembled pack, his hand still cradling Elara's face, his blood still wet on her lips. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the hall, imbued with the full weight of his authority. I came to this pack seeking alliance. Instead, I found treachery, poison, and a leadership that mutilates Omegas for speaking truth. His eyes found Garrick, who had gone pale as bone. But I also found something far more valuable. This Omega, what is your name? Elara. Her voice was stronger now, carrying its own weight. Elara Thornwood. Elara Thornwood invoked the Blood Vow to save my life, knowing it would cost her freedom. She has demanded protection for the vulnerable of this pack, not for herself. She has shown more courage and honor in one act than your Alpha has demonstrated in his entire reign. He paused, letting the words sink in. I grant her demand. Every Omega, every child, every wolf too weak to defend themselves, they are now under my personal protection. Any who harm them answer to me. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Garrick started to protest, but Matthias silenced him with a look that promised violence. And now, the king continued, his voice dropping to something intimate and inexorable. I claim what the vow has given me. He didn't ask permission, didn't hesitate. His hand slid to the back of Elara's neck, tilted her head to expose the vulnerable curve of her throat, and he bit down with the full force of an Alpha King claiming his true mate. Not the polite ceremonial bite of a political pairing, the deep possessive mark that declared to every wolf present that she was his Omega, his Luna, his fate. Elara's cry was swallowed by the bond, snapping into place, a connection so profound it rewrote her understanding of self. She could feel him, his strength, his loneliness, the decades of isolation he'd wrapped around himself like armor. And he could feel her pain, her resilience, the fierce protective love she held for those weaker than herself. When he finally released her throat, the mark was already forming, a silver scar in the shape of his teeth that would never fade. He licked the blood from his lips and addressed the pack one final time. Let this be a lesson. True strength isn't found in titles or territory. It's found in sacrifice, in choosing mercy when cruelty is easier, in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. His arm wrapped around Elara's waist, pulling her against his side. This Omega, this Luna, has more honor than most Alphas I've known. She will stand beside me as my equal, and any who question her place will answer to me personally. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, slowly, one of the kitchen Omegas, a young girl Elara had protected from a brutal beta, dropped to one knee. Then another, and another. Within moments, every Omega in the hall was kneeling, not in submission to the king, but in gratitude to the mute serving girl who had found her voice and used it to save them all. Elara felt tears streak down her face. The king, her mate, her impossible fate, wiped them away with surprising gentleness. "Are you ready?" he murmured against her hair. "This life won't be easy. You'll be challenged, questioned. They'll say you manipulated me, that the vow is dark magic." She turned in his arms, met his storm-gray eyes with her own steady gaze. "I bit an Alpha King to save children who weren't mine. I think I can handle court politics." His laugh was low and genuine, the first real warmth she'd felt from him. Then, let's go home, little Omega. We have a kingdom to rebuild. As they walked from the hall, the Alpha King and his blood-stained Luna, bound by fate and choice in equal measure, Elara looked back once at the pack that had broken her. Garrick would be dealt with, the children would be protected, and she, the mute Omega they'd tried to erase, would become the most powerful Luna in 3 territories.
Destiny, it seemed, had a sense of irony.
In the end, fate is the great equalizer. It sees not titles or status, but the truth of our choices in moments of impossible odds. Elara had nothing, no voice, no power, no hope, but she had courage, and she had love for those even more vulnerable than herself. That was enough, more than enough, because true strength isn't the ability to dominate, it's the willingness to sacrifice everything for those who cannot save themselves. The Alpha King had built an empire on logic and control, but it took a broken Omega to teach him that some bonds transcend reason. The Blood Vow didn't create their connection, it simply revealed what was always meant to be. So I ask you, if you had one moment to change your fate, one chance to save someone at the cost